What's going on, gardeners? It's Sunday, March 19th, and it is almost officially spring here on the southeastern coast of North Carolina. And on today's video, I want to address a very controversial subject because now is the time of year that we need to talk fertilizers. Fertilizers may be one of the most misunderstood things out there, and on today's video I want to explain when you absolutely must use fertilizers in your garden, when you can reduce their use and maybe even avoid them altogether, and why it seems that fertilizers are just so misunderstood. Whether you agree or disagree with any of the things that I say in this video, I would really like your feedback. Please post a comment, give me your take on things, I'd love to hear it. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing and hitting the bell to receive new video notifications, and check out our Amazon storefront and spread shop in the video description for a list of the gardening products I use and awesome custom designed apparel and other gear. Your support is greatly appreciated. Anytime I make a tutorial video on this channel where I show you how I fertilize things, I always get a good bit of pushback in the comments section, and it's probably why, honestly, a lot of garden channels avoid the fertilizing subject altogether, and I don't really blame them. However, I want to do my best to try and address some of these comments. I usually get pushback about fertilizing in two different forms. The first form is the idea that fertilizer is too expensive, and if you're going to spend all this money to fertilize your garden, it really defeats the purpose of gardening, and you may as well just buy food from the grocery store. And the second bit of pushback is the idea that if you're fertilizing your garden, you're doing something wrong because nature doesn't need fertilizer. So if you actually need fertilizer in your garden, it's because you're not allowing the soil to do the work for you. So I want to do my best to try and address these two comments and have an open discussion, hopefully down in the comments section below, and I'll give you my honest take on things. The first point that I want to address is the idea that fertilizer is not required at all in your garden, and you just need to let the soil do the work for you. And the idea here usually is that you can grow food without the addition of fertilizers when you focus on soil biology and composting. That way the soil does the work for you. And while I think there are valid points to this, I think that there is a mixing of various principles from permaculture and food forestry that don't necessarily work in vegetable gardening. Let me explain. The rear of my property backs up into a forest, and obviously we're not going out and fertilizing a forest. It is a completely self-sustaining system. So the idea is, if forest can sustain itself, can't every system sustain itself? That's the very principle behind permaculture, where we can design our own food forest that will flourish whether we intervene or not. And that is obviously a proven concept. As long as we are selecting species and varieties of fruit trees that are reasonable for our zone and our climate, then yes, once you plant all of these fruit trees and you intervene just enough to get them established to the point where you don't need to nurse them anymore, yes, they can become self-sustaining. When planned properly, a food forest will become a self-sustaining ecosystem. That's because each individual tree, when you add up all of the individual roots and you place them next to each other, they will stretch for miles. So they have the ability to find food and nutrients all over the earth. These trees will also act like a self-mulching forest. Whether they're deciduous or evergreen, they will lose their leaves every single year in various patterns, and all of those leaves will fall to the ground and re-mulch the soil. That will then turn into compost, and that will then feed the trees all over again for another life cycle. Yes, it's a little more complicated than that because trees also do draw nutrients out of the air, and there are things that probably I don't even understand about the systems that make it work. But the point is, once it is established, I could leave this house for 30 years and come back, and the food forest will still be standing and still be producing without my intervention. So when planting fruit trees or designing a food forest for some type of permaculture system, you will need to give them fertilizer in the beginning after you transplant them and for the next few seasons to help them establish and grow big and strong. But there will come a point where they become self-sustaining because the root system and its own self-mulching system can largely handle the needs of the tree itself. Now for me, I will always give my trees some fertilizer because it increases their fruit production. However, it doesn't become mandatory at a certain point. And I have no doubt that if I left this house and did not come back for 30 years, this fig tree right here would still be alive and producing fruit. But this is not true for your vegetable garden. Your vegetable garden is unsustainable. Yes, you heard me correctly. Your vegetable garden is not sustainable. It's a freak of nature. It's a man-made thing. Nowhere in nature will you find a vegetable garden growing. And this is the case for two distinct reasons. The first reason is that the plants that we grow in our vegetable garden in no way represents the wild types of the plants. And I'm not talking about anything GMO. I'm talking about the simple act of seed saving over generations. The goal of nature is to reproduce. So in order for nature to reproduce best, it wants its fruits to be small, full of seeds, and have a relatively low sugar content because they are less likely to be eaten and the seeds are more likely to be dropped to the ground. Those are the dominant genetic traits that nature wants. However, we save seeds largely for recessive traits. Those big heirloom tomatoes that weigh a pound each and have very few seeds and are all meat, nature doesn't want them, and that's why they are so susceptible to pests and diseases. They're not a natural creation. There is nothing less natural than we're growing in our common vegetable gardens than these heirloom fruits that have been protected for 50 plus years from cross-pollination. Cross-pollination and hybridization is the law of nature, and we are preventing the natural order of things from taking place. These large-fruited behemoth plants demand a lot of nutrition for the soil. Nature wasn't cut out to produce a whole garden full of these guys. They need a lot of food. The second problem is we're also planting all of these plants in really high density. When it comes to vegetable gardening, high density is the name of the game to maximize yields. And the fact is, the soil biology on its own, the native nutrients in the soil, cannot sustain this high density planting with these super vigorous, super saved seeds that have these monster fruits on them. It just can't keep up. And because we are planting things so unnaturally and we're demanding so much from our soil, we have to add back to that soil artificially. And that's where fertilizers come in. So remember when I said if I left my yard for 30 years and there was no human intervention on this property at all, I could come back and I would still have my fig trees and my apple trees and my peach trees and my persimmon trees producing? Well, what would happen if I planted out my entire garden in May and then I just left and I never came back for 30 years? What would I find 30 years later? The answer is I would find a garden full of weeds and native grasses that have taken over the area, and probably maybe a handful of plants that were hardy enough for my location that have cross-pollinated so many times over that whatever fruit they have basically moved back and now resemble the original wild type and are nothing like what I had originally planted from those saved seeds. The reason why that is true is because there is no truly sustainable vegetable garden, at least not a true vegetable garden as we consider a vegetable garden to be. So my point in all of this is, if you're growing a vegetable garden, at least in the traditional sense that most of us see a vegetable garden to be, there's no way to truly make it permaculture. While you can have a permaculture food forest that you can reduce or eliminate fertilizing in the long run, with your vegetable garden, because of what we're growing and how we're growing it, it is always going to demand more from the soil than it can put back into the soil. And for that reason, we have to add external fertilizing. Now let's address the second point, which is discontinuing the use of fertilizers and using compost instead to fertilize your garden. My answer to that is compost is not fertilizer. We do not add compost to our gardens to fertilize it. We add compost to our gardens to add organic matter into the soil and feed that microbiome to keep it a very healthy growing medium for growing our plants. Yes, there is a fertilizer component to compost, but it's not why we add compost. Let me explain. To determine how much fertilizer is in a product, we consult the NPK ratio on the bag. With the NPK ratio, the first number is the percentage of elemental nitrogen by weight in the fertilizer, the second number is the percentage of weight of phosphorus in the fertilizer, and the third number is the percentage of weight of potassium in the fertilizer. So just to keep things simple, if we were to go out and buy a 100-pound bag of 10-10-10 fertilizer, the contents of that bag would be 10 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer, 10 pounds of phosphorus fertilizer, 10 pounds of potassium fertilizer, and the other 70 pounds would be some inert medium. Yesterday I went to Lowe's and I bought this very popular national brand of cow manure compost for $5.98, and this is listed as an NPK ratio of 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. That means the contents of this bag is 0.5% nitrogen, 0.5% phosphorus and 0.5% potassium. Per the guaranteed analysis on the back of the bag, it assumes a net weight of 35 pounds. So if we take the 35 pounds and we multiply it by 1.5%, because that is the total amount of fertilizer in the bag, we see that this bag contains 0.525 pounds of fertilizer per bag. So since each bag costs $5.98, that means we are paying approximately $11.39 per pound of fertilizer. Let's compare that cost to a typical water-soluble fertilizer. This is a 1.5 pound box of 18-18-21 that you can buy for $6.98. That means this is 57% fertilizer when you add up all the NPKs. This 1.5 pound box has 0.855 pounds of fertilizer. Since we paid $6.98 for this, this brings our cost of fertilizer down to $8.16 a pound, which is 40% less expensive than fertilizing your garden with compost. And remember, this is a very exaggerated claim because this is assuming peak prices of fertilizer moving into the growing season. Yes, you can save money on compost when you buy it by the truckload versus going to the store and buying bags. However, the cost of compost doesn't really change all that much throughout the season. Every fall, I show you how to go to big box stores and buy out their fertilizer when it's all on clearance. I get up to 70 to 80% off every single season. So because of this, I dramatically reduce the costs feeding my garden by using real fertilizers instead of paying a hefty premium to use compost as a fertilizer. In addition, in order to run this analysis, I had to use Black Cow brand compost because it is the only compost product I could find that had a guaranteed analysis on it. Because they are a large brand, they probably have a lot of dollars reserved to marketing, so it's worth it for them to run the guaranteed analysis. If you're making your own compost at home or you're buying compost from a smaller brand or from a local landscaping supply company, they're probably not doing that, so you're going to get compost that doesn't have nearly as much fertilizer in it as the product that I used. So no matter what you do, compost cannot compare to fertilizer when it comes to NPK. My point here is not to knock compost. I use a ton of compost in my yard and garden every single year. My point is that compost isn't fertilizer. If you treat it as fertilizer, it will be the most expensive way to feed your garden. I'm simply trying to show you how to do this a cheaper, more efficient way. You still need to add compost to feed your soil and to make that microbiome really healthy. However, you shouldn't rely only on compost to feed your garden. You should buy fertilizers because it will dramatically reduce the price, especially when you buy your fertilizers in the fall when they go on clearance. You will save a ton of money, and especially if you buy the bulk size clearance items. However, there is a loophole to make everything I just said about prices null and void. After 2 years of saving and searching, last week I finally had the privilege of becoming a member of the Pickup Truck Club. I purchased a used pickup truck, and this allows me to exploit some loopholes that make gardening a whole lot less expensive. Start checking at your county and your neighboring county's landfills, because many of them are responsible for their own tree trimming and maintenance of the right-of-ways of the various highways. So they wind up with a ton of organic material that they don't have anything to do with, and it costs them a ton of money to get rid of. So what they do is they have certain days of the week where you can come and take all the free mulch that you want, and sometimes they even have free compost. If you have a pickup truck, you can now call around and find out if they have the items in stock, and you can go there and load up the back of your truck completely for free. And that will blow the budget out of the water because you will be able to get basically as much compost and free fertilizer for your garden as you're willing to put your back into and put the time into. Now you may be thinking, I'm not spending thousands of dollars to save money on compost. Well, if you own a pickup truck, you know that it's an investment in an overall quality of life improvement, and given everything I do in my garden, it's really worth the investment to me. However, if you don't own a pickup truck or a pickup truck is not the cards for you, you probably know someone that does, so maybe buy them lunch or buy them dinner and have them take you over to the landfill, and you can go pick up your own free compost and mulch yourself. So for those of you that think you don't have enough money to fertilize your garden, between the fall clearance sales on fertilizer, that tip I just gave you, and also the free compost and mulch tip from your county that I just gave you, that should help put your mind at ease if you find the money it takes to grow your own vegetables may be a little bit costly. But remember, due to the nature of vegetable gardening, gardening, you will have to get some amount of fertilizer and compost, but there are affordable ways that you can do it. But before I conclude this video, I wanted to take a moment and discuss container gardening, because container gardens break all the rules. Because you're confined to this little space to grow your plants, you do not have a significant microbiome like you would find in ground in earth. And because of that reason, the granulated organic fertilizers are not the best. They don't break down quickly enough. And using compost can also be a problem, because you're only going to have about a 2 or 3 inch lip in the container to apply compost. So you really can't put more than like a 1 inch layer in there, and then you'll have to remove it to add more. It's a big pain. So when you container garden, in order to keep your trees sated, you really should use water-soluble fertilizers. So things like Jack's All-Purpose 20-20-20 or Miracle Grow Tomato, or if you want to stay completely organic, you can use things like fish emulsion, kelp meal, and Alaska Moor Bloom, which is quite a bit more expensive, but that's what you have to do, unfortunately, to stay completely organic in a container garden. And it's why I blend my fertilizers usually with a mix of fish emulsion and things like Jack's All-Purpose 20-20-20 in order to reduce costs when growing things in containers. So I just wanted to take a moment and address the importance of using water-soluble fertilizers in your container garden due to the lack of microbiome and the lack of soil mass. So now that spring is imminent, I'm really glad I took this moment to discuss these various topics of fertilizing, because I know how controversial they can be. I hope I made a strong case for why I believe what I believe. Whether you agree or disagree, I would love to hear your feedback and your experience, so please comment down in the comments below and we can have a discussion about these various topics. I really enjoyed making this video, and stay tuned, because pretty soon I will have a video on how to fertilize your fruit trees as they come out of dormancy now that spring is upon us. So everybody, I sure hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you're notified when we release more videos like these. If you're curious about any of the products that I use in real life in my garden, they are all linked down below in my Amazon storefront in the video description, so expand that video description to see everything I use in real life. And while you're there, check out my spread shop for custom merch if you want to support the channel. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see all of you again on the next video. If there's one thing Dale knows, it's good food. We're gonna give Dale the best treat, a fig dipped in a little bit of peanut butter. Oh, and he's being very good, patiently waiting. Ready, buddy? Be gentle. Good boy. How's that? Wonderful way to start the day.